Within the deepest chambers of your being lies a dormant power so profound that its awakening can transform not just your life, but your very essence. This power, the Christ consciousness, is not something external to you, not something that must be sought in distant lands or sacred texts. It is already within you, waiting to be recognized and awakened. Cayce revealed this shocking truth decades ago, yet it remains one of the most misunderstood spiritual concepts of our time. The Christ consciousness is not reserved for a select few or for those deemed worthy by external standards. It is your birthright, the divine spark that connects your individual soul to the universal consciousness of creation itself. Many seekers spend lifetimes looking outward for what has always been within. They search for salvation in buildings of worship, in the words of teachers, in rituals and practices that, while valuable, are merely signposts pointing to an inner reality. The most profound truth is that the kingdom of heaven is truly within you, just as the ancient wisdom traditions have always taught. This inner power remains dormant not because it is weak, but because we have forgotten how to access it. Our attention has been directed outward for so long that the inward path has become overgrown and difficult to discern. Yet this path leads to the greatest treasure imaginable, the awakening of your true divine nature. The Christ consciousness represents the highest potential of the human soul, a state of being where love becomes the governing force in your life, where compassion flows naturally, and where the artificial boundaries between yourself and others begin to dissolve. It is a level of awareness where you recognize that the same divine spark that animates you also animates all of creation. This is not a metaphorical concept, but a literal transformation of consciousness. When awakened, this inner power allows you to see with new eyes, to perceive reality beyond the veil of separation and fear that governs much of human experience. You begin to recognize the sacred in the ordinary, the divine in the mundane, and the eternal in the temporal. The shocking truth that many spiritual traditions have obscured is that this consciousness is not something you must earn or achieve. It is what you are at your core. The journey is not one of becoming, but of remembering, removing the layers of conditioning, fear, and ego identification that have covered this inner light. Think of it as the sun that has been temporarily obscured by clouds. The sun doesn't cease to exist when hidden from view. It continues to shine with undiminished brilliance. Similarly, your Christ consciousness continues to exist within you, regardless of whether you're aware of it or not. The spiritual journey is simply the process of clearing away the clouds that have hidden this inner sun. What makes this truth so revolutionary is that it places the power of spiritual transformation directly in your hands. You need not wait for an external savior or for some future time when you might be deemed worthy. The time is now, and the power is already within you. The awakening of this consciousness begins with a simple acknowledgement, a willingness to consider that there might be more to your nature than what you have been taught to believe. It starts with questioning the limitations you have accepted, and opening to the possibility that your true essence is divine, unlimited, and eternal. The path to awakening the Christ consciousness begins with silence, not just the absence of noise, but a profound inner quietude where the constant chatter of the mind gradually subsides. This silence is the fertile soil from which spiritual awareness grows. Without it, the subtle vibrations of your higher nature cannot be perceived amid the cacophony of everyday thoughts and concerns. In this sacred silence, you create the space for divine presence to emerge. It is not something you can force or manufacture. Rather, it is a natural unfolding that occurs when you stop interfering with the process. The mind, with its endless stream of judgments, fears, and desires, acts as a veil that obscures your true nature. When this veil is temporarily lifted through meditation, the Christ consciousness can begin to shine through the gaps between your thoughts. Meditation is not merely a practice, but a state of being, a way of relating to existence with receptivity and awareness. It is in this receptive state that the divine can communicate with you directly, without the distortions of ego and intellect. The still, small voice that speaks in silence carries more wisdom than volumes of spiritual texts studied by the analytical mind alone. The ancient wisdom that has been preserved through various traditions points to this same fundamental truth. that direct communion with the divine occurs in moments of inner stillness. Yet many spiritual seekers mistakenly believe that awakening requires complex practices or esoteric knowledge. The truth is both simpler and more challenging. It requires the courage to be present with yourself in complete honesty and vulnerability. Aligning with divine love is the essential catalyst for this awakening process. Love is not merely an emotion, but a vibrational frequency that resonates with the Christ consciousness. When you consciously cultivate love, not just for those who are easy to love, but for all beings, including yourself, you naturally attune to this higher state of being. This universal, unconditional love is the very essence of the Christ consciousness itself. The practice of loving kindness becomes a powerful method for awakening. Begin with yourself, offering compassion to your own struggles and limitations. Then gradually extend this circle of compassion outward to encompass friends, neutral persons, difficult people, and eventually all living beings. This progressive expansion of the heart's capacity mirrors the expanding awareness that characterizes the awakening of Christ consciousness. Intention plays a crucial role in this process. The spiritual path is directed by the power of your focused intention. When you sincerely intend to awaken the Christ consciousness within, you set in motion forces that will support this unfolding. Your intention creates an energetic pathway through which divine grace can flow into your life. This intention must be purified of egocentric motives. Seeking spiritual awakening for personal gain, to feel superior to others, or to escape life's challenges will only strengthen the very ego structures that block the Christ consciousness from emerging. The intention must be rooted in service, in the desire to awaken for the benefit of all beings, not just yourself. Daily spiritual practice establishes the foundation upon which higher awareness can build. Through consistent meditation, prayer, and contemplation, you create neural pathways that support expanded consciousness. What begins as conscious effort eventually becomes your natural state of being. The moments of awakening that initially come as brief glimpses gradually extend into longer periods of clarity and presence. The body itself must be prepared for this awakening. The Christ consciousness is not separate from your physical being, but expresses through it. Practices that purify and balance the body, proper nutrition, adequate rest, mindful movement, create the conditions for spiritual energies to flow freely through your system. The ancient concept of the body as a temple takes on new meaning when you understand that it is literally the vessel for divine consciousness to manifest in the world. Patience and persistence are essential qualities on this journey. The awakening of Christ consciousness is not an instantaneous event, but a gradual unfolding that occurs over time. There will be periods of apparent regression, plateaus where nothing seems to be happening, and sudden breakthroughs that transform your understanding. Through it all, the commitment to remain on the path despite these fluctuations is what ultimately leads to lasting transformation. As you take these first steps toward awakening, remember that you are not alone on this journey. The very consciousness you seek to awaken is already guiding you from within, orchestrating the circumstances and encounters that will best serve your spiritual evolution. Trust in this inner guidance, for it knows the way home better than your limited mind ever could. The greatest obstacle to awakening the Christ consciousness within you is not external but internal. It is the dominance of the ego mind and the fear-based thinking that permeates your daily existence. This truth, shared by Cayce and echoed by spiritual teachers throughout the ages, reveals why spiritual awakening often feels like an uphill battle, despite your sincere efforts and intentions. The ego is not your enemy to be destroyed, but rather a limited identity structure that has forgotten its true nature. It is a necessary aspect of human experience that allows you to function in the physical world. However, when the ego assumes complete control of your consciousness, identifying itself as the totality of who you are, it becomes the primary barrier to spiritual awakening. This mistaken identity is the root of all spiritual disconnection. The ego believes itself to be separate, a fragile entity constantly threatened by the world around it. From this illusory separation arises fear, and from fear spring all the negative emotions and behaviors that cause suffering: greed, anger, jealousy, pride, and attachment. These fear-based patterns create a dense energetic field that blocks the radiance of the Christ consciousness from shining through. The ego maintains its dominance through an intricate system of defenses. It constantly seeks validation and security in external achievements, possessions, relationships, and social recognition. It creates elaborate stories about who you are, what you deserve, and how the world should be. When reality fails to match these stories, suffering inevitably follows. The ego interprets this suffering as further evidence that the world is threatening, thus strengthening its defensive posture in a self-perpetuating cycle. The most insidious aspect of ego dominance is how it co-opts even spiritual practice for its own purposes. The ego can become spiritualized, taking pride in its knowledge, experiences, or perceived advancement on the path. It can create a spiritual identity that is just as limiting as any worldly identity. This spiritual materialism, the collection of experiences and insights as possessions of the ego, becomes yet another barrier to authentic awakening. Fear, the constant companion of the ego, manifests in countless subtle ways that may not be immediately recognized as fear. Perfectionism, people-pleasing, procrastination, excessive planning, endless seeking, and even spiritual bypassing are all rooted in fear. These patterns keep you trapped in familiar territory, preventing the surrender necessary for Christ consciousness to emerge. The battle with the ego is not won through force or resistance. What you resist persists and even strengthens. Instead, the path forward involves developing awareness of ego patterns without judgment, understanding them with compassion, and gradually disidentifying from them. This is not about destroying the ego, but transcending it, including it within a larger, more expansive identity that recognizes the ego as just one aspect of your multidimensional being. Witnessing is a powerful practice in this process. By cultivating the ability to observe your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without becoming entangled in them, you develop what spiritual traditions call the witness consciousness. This witnessing presence exists beyond the ego and connects directly to the Christ consciousness. From this vantage point, you can see the ego's maneuvers without being controlled by them. The practice of self-inquiry accelerates this disidentification. By consistently questioning your assumptions, beliefs, and reactions with questions like, "Who am I beyond this thought?" or "What is aware of this feeling?" you pierce through the veils of ego identification. These questions point to the unchanging awareness that exists prior to all mental content, the pure consciousness that is your true nature. Forgiveness becomes essential in releasing the ego's grip. The ego maintains its separation through grievances, resentments, and judgments. Each unforgiven hurt becomes a brick in the wall that separates you from your divine nature. Forgiveness of others, of yourself, and of life itself dissolves these barriers. True forgiveness recognizes that from the perspective of Christ consciousness, there is nothing to forgive, as all beings are acting from their current level of awareness. Surrender is perhaps the most challenging and transformative aspect of this battle. The ego interprets surrender as defeat or loss, but spiritual surrender is actually an opening to a greater power and wisdom. It is the recognition that your limited perspective cannot grasp the full complexity of existence. When you surrender your need to control, to understand, to be right, or to protect your self-image, you create space for the Christ consciousness to flow through you unimpeded. The paradox of spiritual awakening is that what feels like a battle is ultimately revealed as an illusion. There is no battle, only the gradual recognition of what has always been true. The Christ consciousness is your original nature, not something to be attained, but something to be remembered. The ego's resistance is like the struggle of a wave that fears returning to the ocean, not realizing that it has never been separate from the ocean, even for a moment. As you navigate this terrain of ego transcendence, remember that every moment of awareness is a victory. Every act of love weakens the ego's grip, and every instance of genuine presence allows more of your true nature to shine through. The battle is not won in a single decisive moment, but through thousands of small choices to align with truth rather than illusion, with love rather than fear, with presence rather than distraction. The awakening of Christ consciousness within you unleashes a profound healing power that transforms every aspect of your existence: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. This healing force operates on levels far beyond the reach of conventional approaches, addressing the root causes of suffering rather than merely alleviating symptoms. Your physical body naturally responds to the elevated vibration of Christ consciousness. The cells themselves become more coherent, more harmonized with the divine blueprint of perfect health. Chronic conditions that have resisted traditional treatments often begin to resolve as the energetic blockages that underlie physical manifestations are dissolved. This is not miracle healing in the conventional sense, but rather the restoration of natural order as the body aligns with its highest potential. The healing occurs because Christ consciousness operates at the causal level of creation. Physical ailments are often the final expression of distortions that begin in the energy field, the emotions, the mind, and ultimately in the soul's relationship with the divine. As the Christ consciousness permeates these subtle dimensions, it naturally corrects imbalances before they can manifest as disease. The body's innate intelligence for self-healing is amplified exponentially when no longer obstructed by fear, resentment, or separation. Emotional wounds that have festered for decades, even those from childhood or previous incarnations, find resolution in the presence of this healing consciousness. Trauma that has been stored in the cellular memory begins to release as the light of awareness shines into previously avoided areas of pain. The compassionate presence of Christ consciousness provides a safe container in which these wounded aspects can finally be acknowledged, embraced, and integrated. This emotional healing manifests as a profound shift from reactivity to responsiveness. Situations that once triggered automatic defensive patterns now become opportunities for conscious choice. The emotional body becomes more fluid, no longer dominated by rigid patterns of contraction and avoidance. A natural emotional resilience emerges, not because difficult emotions are suppressed, but because they can now move through you without becoming stuck or defining your identity. Mental healing occurs as the constant stream of judgmental, fearful, and divisive thoughts gradually subsides. The mind, which has been trained to seek problems and anticipate threats, begins to recognize the perfection inherent in each moment. Chronic anxiety, depression, and negative thought patterns that have resisted years of therapy often yield to this higher consciousness because it addresses not just the content of thoughts, but the very structure of thinking itself. The healing extends beyond your individual self to encompass all your relationships. As you embody more of your Christ nature, you naturally evoke the highest potential in others. Your presence becomes a silent invitation for others to recognize their own divine essence. Conflicts that once seemed irresolvable find unexpected pathways to harmony, not through compromise or sacrifice, but through the recognition of a shared purpose and identity beyond personal interests. Perhaps most significantly, the Christ consciousness heals the burden of karma that souls carry across lifetimes. Karmic patterns are not punishments, but opportunities for learning and growth, lessons that the soul needs to complete its evolution. The awakening of Christ consciousness accelerates this evolutionary process, allowing for the resolution of karmic debts through understanding rather than suffering. What might have taken many lifetimes to learn through difficult experiences can be integrated in moments of clear seeing from this expanded state of awareness. This karmic healing manifests as a profound sense of freedom, freedom from compulsive patterns, freedom from the weight of the past, freedom from the anxiety about the future. You begin to recognize that you are not bound by predetermined fate, but are a co-creator with the divine, capable of responding to each moment with fresh awareness rather than conditioned patterns. The healing power of Christ consciousness reaches where conventional solutions fail because it addresses the fundamental illusion that underlies all suffering, the illusion of separation from the divine source. Physical treatments may temporarily alleviate bodily symptoms, but cannot reach the spiritual disconnect that manifests as disease. Psychological approaches may provide intellectual understanding of emotional patterns, but often cannot access the soul level where true transformation occurs. This healing force operates according to divine wisdom rather than human expectations. It may not always manifest as an immediate cure for specific conditions, particularly when those conditions are serving an important purpose in the soul's evolution. Instead, it provides the precise form of healing that best serves your highest good in any given moment. Sometimes this means the dissolution of physical symptoms. Other times, it means a transformation in how you relate to challenging circumstances. As this consciousness awakens within you, you naturally become a channel for healing energy to flow to others. Without conscious effort, your presence becomes therapeutic. This does not make you a healer in the ego sense. It is not you doing the healing, but rather the Christ consciousness working through you as you step out of the way. You become an instrument through which divine healing can express itself according to the needs and receptivity of those you encounter. This healing power is available to everyone, regardless of religious background, spiritual training, or past history. It is your birthright as a soul created in the divine image. The only requirements for accessing this healing force are sincerity, willingness, and the courage to face whatever stands between you and the full recognition of your true nature. The awakening of Christ consciousness represents the fulfillment of the promise at the core of all spiritual traditions, that suffering is not the final word, that healing at the deepest level is not only possible, but inevitable as you align with the truth of who you are. This is the shocking truth that transforms mere spiritual theory into lived experience. The healing you have sought in countless external sources has always resided within you, waiting only for your recognition and consent to restore you to wholeness. The wisdom of Christ consciousness is not just to be read, but to be lived. If these teachings have resonated with your spirit, take the first step by subscribing to this channel now. Each comment you leave helps spread this transformative message to others who are searching. Share how these words have touched your journey. Your experience might be the light someone else needs. Subscribe, comment, and join our growing community of awakening souls. The path to your highest consciousness awaits, and we'll walk it together.